Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to SDS Thursday. Good to see you all. I'm still admitting people in. So while we are letting more people in, I'll be very grateful if you start typing and let us know some information about you. Today's presenter is Professor Andrew Reeves. You probably have worked with him in the past with us or through maybe BACP. And Andrew is always very interested to know who is in the room tonight. So please just type a few things about yourself, where you are in the world, what setting you're working in, why you've decided to join us tonight. Are you a supervisor? Do you sometimes supervise people who work with high-risk clients? Do you supervise risk? Is it something what you would like to learn more about? What kind of age group you're working with? And are you here more as a therapist or more as a supervisor? All this information will be very useful for Andrew, both tonight and during his course in March, which we will be discussing today. Okay, so as always, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Julia Budnik, and I'm one of the directors of SDS, but my co-director, Paul Grantham, is not joining us tonight. He left it all in Andrew's and mine capable hands, so I'm sure we'll be fine. And so today, before I pass the microphone to Professor Andrew Reeves, I want, as always, take you through SDS website and the courses which we are offering to you in March, because it is almost upon us. So I'll share my screen and just take you through some courses which we need to be aware of. Okay, so as always, you click on the SDS front page and you're either going and looking at upcoming events here, or you click on all courses. You can always see our most popular courses because our courses are listed in order of popularity, and you can see that Supervision Skills BPS Approved Certificate is our most popular course, always fully booked, as well as CBT Introductory course. So these two courses, if you want to book on them, book early. And then you click on calendar view and you can see what is coming your way in March. So in March, we're starting on the 2nd and 3rd of March with Socratic questioning workshop. It is an experiential workshop. It is live on Zoom, and we are asking people to come live to this course. You can't receive the certificate by just watching the recording. However, what we've decided, we will be giving those who participated live access to the recording of the course, so you have a reference point and you can double check certain things which you might have forgotten after a while. So you will receive a recording, but you still need to participate in Socratic questioning workshop live in order to practice Socratic questioning and receive your feedback and practice again. And it is an experiential course. So the course is a small group workshop. We still have a few places left, but not many. So if you're thinking of booking it, please book quickly. 2nd and 3rd of March, this course will be happening on Zoom. And you can see straight after that, on the 8th and 9th of March, will be the course which we will be discussing tonight. So this is a course, The Challenges of Supervising Risk and Counseling and Psychotherapy. and it will be presented by Professor Andrew Reeves, who, if I'm right, you were a chair, is it a chair, Andrew, of BACP for many years? Yeah, about 5 years you were a chair? 4, 5? Yeah. Okay, that's about right. Because I remember opening therapy today, and there will be always Andrew's picture as a chair, saying something very wise about counseling and psychotherapy. So this is Andrew Reeves, and those who worked with you, with Professor Andrew Reeves, on working with suicide, you will agree with me that he is an amazing presenter. He is incredibly informed, compassionate, thoughtful, and everything he says is very beautifully researched. He doesn't just pluck things out of the air. He knows what he's talking about. So Andrew will be presenting this course again on Zoom over 2 days, but it is a 6-hour CPD course. So it will be 2 mornings, 2-3 hours apart. So you will still have time to do things in the afternoon, see your clients, and you will hopefully not experience any Zoom fatigue whatsoever. So 2-part, 3 hours, 2 mornings on the 8th and 9th of March. And as always, we keep our super early bird discount until the evening of SDS Thursday. So those who came here and booked tonight still can enjoy super early bird discount, which is considerable discount, £150 for a full day course rather than £195. So it's £45 before that discount. So if you like tonight's session, just go on the website and book tonight because it expires at midnight. Okay, so I think that is the main information I wanted to share with you. Let me just check that I'm not missing. Yes, another thing I just wanted to mention, we are running in March also a 3-part masterclass with the founder of National Center for Eating Disorders, Deanne Jade, on eating disorders in adolescents. If you haven't booked on that course, and that course is practically at the top of its booking numbers now, we still have some places left, but please book quickly because that course definitely will be fully booked. So 3 dates, 2-hour masterclasses on eating disorders, anorexia, body images, body dysphoria, and obesity, and that's all in March. So please don't miss that. Okay, so the only one other thing, I will ask you all to please make sure that your microphones are muted while Andrew is presenting. But at the end, we will have, as always, time for questions, and then you will be able to unmute yourself and ask your question if you have one, or you are very welcome to put your questions in the chat box, and I will try my best to keep an eye on them and ask Andrew questions which you typed in. Okay, I think that's about it from me, and I'm very, very happy to present Professor Andrew Reeves, who will take you on today's journey. Andrew.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you everyone for coming along. It's nice to see you all. I hope you're keeping safe and well. When I come off this call, I'm going to remind my family that Julia says that everything I say is beautifully phrased and well researched. And so when they disagree with me, they'll know they haven't got a leg to stand on. So thank you for that, Julia. That's very, very helpful. It's lovely to see you, and thanks for putting your comments in the chat, and what a wealth of experience we have here today, which kind of supports my decision as to how I wanted to kind of do this kind of short session, which was more about kind of us sharing our thoughts and experiences in what it's like to kind of supervise in a whole range of different settings when we're supervising people who are working with clients who will present at risk in kind of risk of suicide or perhaps self-injury, and to kind of think about kind of some of the challenges that we face. I've got a few slides to share with you, not many, because I thought what I would do is kind of use the slides to set the scene, and then for us to open it up for a discussion and a chat. So it's always risky when you're doing online training where you say, has anyone got any thoughts? And you then get 25 faces staring back at you, and you get that excruciating Zoom silence feeling. I did say to a group today, I was doing some face-to-face teaching today, and I asked the group a question. It was a year 2 psychology degree group. I asked the group a question, they all looked at me and nobody said anything. And I did say this was less intimidating than if they were doing that on Teams. So if you do it, then I'll only go into a meltdown and we'll fill the silence with a load of blabber. So please do say things that are useful for you. So yeah, I'm Andrew. I mean, like many of you, I've worked in a range of contexts. I've been a social worker and a therapist for about 35 years in a range of settings, from statutory settings, kind of mental health, crisis intervention settings where I supervised direct work with people, university settings, college settings. I supervise people who work in the third sector, supervise people who work in school settings, and do a lot of schools counselling supervision, which, as we know, there's a lot of safeguarding stuff that comes in there and that we have to hold on to. Plus, I also work as in a very small independent practice and do some independent practice supervision, which brings its own challenges as well. Sometimes I think that perhaps independent practice can be one of the most challenging areas to work in, because if we're working in an organization, then even if we kind of don't agree with or don't like what the organization is saying, we're kind of held within it. Whereas when we work independently, it sometimes can feel a bit more exposing. And I did a piece of research many years ago which asked BACP accredited training programs at the time how they prepared their students to work with clients at risk. And almost all of them said that one of the predominant areas of learning they felt for their students was in supervision whilst they were on placement. Much more so than their kind of formal teaching on the course. And certainly that's my experience. I think things have improved a little bit, but risk is something that we still don't seem to spend an awful lot of time talking about, given that I think most of us work with risk in our own client work and supervise people who work with risk. So it always seems slightly baffling to me that this is something that causes so much anxiety for people, that can feel really scary, and yet people are given perhaps not as much training and guidance as they might in their core training, and they are encouraged to turn to their supervisors for their training, which of course is no bad thing, because that's one of our roles as supervisors, isn't it? It's to be able to kind of that formative function, that development of skills and knowledge and ability. But then I thought to myself, well, if therapists aren't particularly well trained around working with risk and they're encouraged to turn to their supervisors, how well are supervisors trained to work with risk? In terms of supervision training courses, and I reflected back on the supervision training course I did a while ago, to a very reputable place and in every other respect, a really good course. And the only input we had on supervising risk was the bit I had to do as a student presentation. And had I not done that, we'd have had nothing. And I'm sure that's not a universal experience. I'm sure some people have kind of very different experiences, but it kind of just leaves that feeling that I think we do a very good job. But I think that there's more that we can do to support each other in the work. And there's some real tripping hazards, I think, in supervising risk, because we're not only having to work with and respect our own responses to what's happening. Oops, sorry, I thought I'd done something about that phone. not only do we have to kind of support ourselves with our own responses around risk, but we have to support the supervisees who come with all of their responses as well. And of course, they may not necessarily come with a, this is what I think and this is what I feel. As supervisors, we kind of have to tease that out as best we can. So anyway, that's a lot of talking from me. I'm going to show you some slides, and I want to open it up for our discussion to see kind of what people's kind of thoughts and perspectives are on this. Here we go. Can you all see that? Okay. Yeah, excellent. So supervising risk and counselling and psychotherapy. And there's all sorts of layers of consideration, which I've kind of talked about a little bit already. And I don't claim this list that I'm going to show you is an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's many more that you can add in, but a kind of a quick run through of my own thinking. I thought, so as supervisors, what are we holding in the space? What are we managing the space? And of course, first and foremost is the supervisory relationship. And we know through decades of research that we can have techniques and strategies and ideas and things that we do, but actually fundamentally and at the core to successful therapy, and I would argue successful supervision, is the quality of the supervisory relationship. Somebody that we can trust, that we can talk to, we can respect, we can be challenged by, we can laugh with. I've just had to finish with my supervisor after years of working with her, because she's had to retire through ill health, and it's an absolute nightmare finding a new supervisor, because I'm looking for somebody who ticks boxes like they're experienced, they're grounded, they're authoritative, they're warm, they're empathic, they challenge me, they're open to kind of not knowing themselves, that we can have a really good laugh. Humor is really important to me. If I can't laugh with my supervisor, then really it ain't going to work. And this is it's really struck me for the first time for a long time just how critical this relationship is and how important and hard it is to find somebody who's the right fit. So the supervisory relationship. Obviously, the needs of the supervisee. You know, we're there to support people in practice, often in challenging and difficult circumstances. How do I identify and hold the needs of the supervisee in that context? And our own needs, you know, how do we support ourselves? Maybe we have supervision of supervision, maybe we have peer supervision. I often wondered, you know, with supervision of supervision, I wonder if people who supervise supervision, which I do, whether they have supervision of supervision of supervision, and whether there's supervision of supervision of supervision, and then at some point, perhaps in some beautiful Scottish glen, there is the ultimate supervisor that we all go back to. I know it's just a fantasy I have sometimes when I have nothing better to do. So kind of needs of the supervisor. Central to all of this, of course, is the needs of the client. You know, we're mindful of where the client is at, what the client needs, to help the therapist kind of connect with, not act out, not cause harm, not cause damage, to learn, to build the relationship. I mean, just that one little dot in itself is a huge task that we hold together, either in a group or in an individual supervision. The working context, you know, where are people working? Who are their clients? Who are they expected to see? How many people are they expected to see? I worked in a service for many years that expected me to see 6 people a day, 5 days a week. Extraordinarily high demands on the service. You know, I needed my supervisor to kind of get that and hold that as best I can, which of course is why humour was so important in my supervisor relationships. Working expectations, you know, what does the organization expect us to do, and particularly around risk. You know, there is and we'll explore this more in the sessions, that kind of notion of risk tolerance. As a therapist, how tolerant am I to my client's risk at any given point, and that may change. As an organization, how is the organization risk tolerant? How much can they hold and kind of sustain and support risk? Some schools I work with are very highly risk tolerant. You know, they're really able to kind of support the therapist in doing work with really quite high risk young people. Some other settings, you just need to say the S word, the suicide word, and it's a referral through to the GP and to CAMS or mental health services, which, as we know, is not altogether straightforward. The client group that I've talked about, skills development, you know, it's like the amount of things that we really need to know to be able to do our work. And I don't just mean around client presentation and the particular issues that client bring, but kind of the kind of law, the ethics, the kind of demands of our professional associations, whoever our professional association is. Oh, and I could go on. And so when I did that, I was frankly quite exhausted, and I thought, I don't know how I do all of that in an hour or in an hour and a half, but that's what we do. That's what our supervisees look for. That's what we look for in our supervision, and that's what we hope to deliver. And obviously, we're not meeting all of those spinning plates all of the time equally. Things will ebb and flow, and so we also need to be able to know what the supervisee needs at any particular given point. So let's just to pick up a few of those, just one or two of those areas. You know, this interplay of expectations. You know, if we look at the kind of the predominant way of working around risk in UK, for those of you who attended the recent sessions on working with suicide risk, this very binary approach to risk, you know, this kind of notion that people are either at risk or they're not at risk, which you know is in my personal opinion frankly nonsense. I think people hold different levels of risk all the time in different ways, as do we all. So are we working within a policy which is quite directive? If we are, as supervisors, we need to know that, or a procedure which tries to guide practice, or indeed a guidance document that supports practice. And they are quite different documents and often speak to the level of risk tolerance of the organisation. If we're working in an organisation, organisations with low risk tolerance tend to try and pin it down with a very specific policy. You must do this, you must do this, you must do this. Moving away from that high level of risk tolerance, we can move to kind of procedures, kind of things that are meant to point us in directions but allow for some flexibility. Those organisations that tend to be kind of more settled with the notion of risk tend to offer guidance and can allow degrees of uncertainty to unfold in the work. And it's really important that we know as supervisors the context that our supervisees are working in, but also kind of where do we sit with this? And I often suggest to practitioners, have a conversation with your supervisors now before you hit a crisis situation, and ask the question of your supervisor, what is your tolerance to risk? Where do you sit with this? What would you expect of me in a difficult situation or a situation of challenge? Because my experience is it's often at that point of kind of crisis or anxiety that suddenly things really begin to emerge in the supervisory relationship, some of which can be helpful and some of which less so. So, to summarise, organisations often develop kind of policies to mitigate risk, to attend to what they consider to be their duty of care, and that institutional anxiety can often lead to quite overly prescriptive approaches in working with risk. Risk becomes something that we should mitigate, that we should minimise, that we should kind of try and reduce as best we can. And yet, and here's a discussion point we can come back to when I finish with the slides, my experience is that some of the most profound and important therapy work I've been involved in is where we kind of acknowledged and worked with the risk. We positively took together. I was nearly had a grammatical error then, that we can kind of share that risk between us, and supervisors can play a really important point in that. And we know from research that therapists who struggle with the policy of the organisation will often manage that by disregarding the policy, which kind of puts them and us as supervisors in a bit of a tricky situation. So how do we support supervisees who are working in a context which might be contradictory with or inconsistent to the kind of organisation expectations that they're having to work in? So the demands of context. All sorts of legal differences. If I'm working in a primary school, that will be quite different to a secondary school. If I'm working in a third sector organisation, if I'm working in a statutory organisation, if I'm working with people where the work is already connected with high levels of risk. And I know some of you put in the chat, you know, working with perhaps people who have been through the criminal justice system, or with people who present at high risk. You know, what does the law expect of us? How do we manage kind of those considerations? And how able are we, either because of the context or because of our own position with this, able to work with kind of risk in a positive way? I assert that we all do positive risk taking in our work, because if we didn't, we would simply kind of just refer on to statutory services, the overwhelming majority of people who ever walk through our door. Because my experience is that many people who present in counselling and psychotherapy do so with degrees of risk. And yet we don't do that because we have something useful to offer in of ourselves. That notion of demands of law, I use one example here, kind of the Mental Capacity Act that is in place in England, and there are similar pieces of legislation in other territories too. 4 principles of capacity. Can the client understand the information needed to make a decision about risk? In this instance, can the client remember the information? Can the client weigh up consequences? The client communicate their decision? In a previous job, I was often required to undertake mental capacity assessments of people to see whether we viewed them as having capacity. I'm sure there are other people on this call tonight who do that. It's notoriously difficult. We try and apply science to it. We try and think that there are right and wrong answers. Bottom line is it's a subjective process, and our interpretation of somebody else's understanding, whether it be around capacity or around competence for younger people, is filtered through our own lens and our own anxiety. So we have to unpack that in the supervisory relationship. This for me is one of the biggies, the therapist responses to risk, and this is something that in the full course we'll spend quite a bit of time unpacking. We know from research, and some of you will be familiar with some of this research, and some of you I'll introduce it to in the session, that it's not uncommon for at the first point of reference to suicide for clients to not name it explicitly. They talk about it through kind of metaphor, they hint at it, they allude to it. And we know from that same research that practitioners, regardless of theoretical orientation, and indeed regardless of the age of the client, have a tendency to move back to kind of personally reflective responses. So not asking explicit questions, but instead kind of reflecting with where the client is at. And I'll demonstrate some of that when we do the sessions of what that looks like in practice. Not wrong with reflective responses, nothing at all. They can be incredibly powerful, but if they're used predominantly with clients at risk, they present real issues in terms of the work that we do. And we know that there's this, what depending on your orientation, the literature calls unacknowledged countertransference, kind of unacknowledged feelings on behalf of the practitioner, which will shape their thinking, and they will present to themselves really good reasons why risk was not explored. And then they will bring those to supervision and will present them as really good reasons to you as to why supervision was not, why risk was not explored in the process. And here's an example of some of them. We underestimate levels of distress or intent around risk. We actively, unconsciously, actively set out to avoid a specific exploration. We can be really quick to be reassured about claims of improvement. We think that asking about risk will be seen as clumsy or insensitive. We project our own fears. We might even put the thought into someone's mind, you know, by asking, for example, about suicide. Our fear is we might prompt that. We won't, but our fear is that we can minimize the importance of the relationship. We can inadvertently collude with a premature ending of therapy to kind of avoid that contact with risk. We focus on the risk as purely as a process of manipulation that takes place in the relationship. We too can feel overwhelmed and hopeless. What we don't know can't hurt us. That's a big thing. If we don't ask, we don't know. If we don't know, we don't feel anxious about it? How come we can feel incompetent, fearful, anxious, and impotent in response to our client's risk? These are the processes that go on, we know, for therapists. And what we'll do in the sessions the Julia was talking about before is the ones in red we're going to focus down much more on. So the active avoidance, too quick to be reassured, focus on perceived manipulation, what we don't know can't hurt us, and feelings of incompetence. And we're going to really look at those because they are often the most commonly presented issues that come up in supervision. And there are some video vignettes that we can see those in action with a supervisor that we can also critique. So we can kind of critique the supervisor's intervention with the supervisee around these particular issues, and we can also critique the supervisor's work as a supervisor, and people often go to town on that as well. So we can really see how our therapists, our supervisees, can present a scenario in supervision, not deliberately or with any deliberate intention of misleading or avoiding, but actually acting out a level of countertransference or kind of impact that is out of the supervisee's awareness that is unacknowledged. And our task as supervisor is really to connect with that, to kind of move around the side of it, and to really help the supervisee reflect on kind of where they're at and what's happening for them in that moment. Because without doing that, then we run the risk as supervisors of colluding with an avoidance of risk. And part of our task is about helping our supervisees not collude with avoidance of risk. And in that process, of course, we also have to ask questions about ourselves, about, again, what is our risk tolerance? How able are we at this particular point to be able to go to those risky places? So just a very quick run over of some of the areas that we're going to cover. But I thought what would be really helpful was to kind of come back and see if there was anything that I'd said that you agreed with from your experience, or you saw differently and disagreed with, and kind of areas that you've experienced either as a supervisor in trying to kind of connect with your supervisees, or indeed as a therapist going to see your supervisor, kind of some of the challenges in doing that. So I'm hoping we don't get the Zoom silence and that you're all going to unmute immediately and fight for the space to talk.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I can see that Georgia already unmuted herself, and my guess is probably she wants to say something.
Oh my goodness, yes. No, sorry, Julia, I had accidentally unmuted myself, but I've enjoyed everything so far. I'm writing it all down. Sorry, I have nothing to add to this at the moment.
That's okay. That's okay.
It's great when people unmute, isn't it? Because you can be on them straight away.
Well, exactly. If you unmute yourself, go ahead. Cashel, I can see you are having your hand up.
Cashel, hello. Hi.
Cashel, are you able to say anything tonight about peer supervision? I'm in a group of 4. So I consider myself a supervisor.
Yeah, I mean, peer supervision is hugely important, and I too am in a peer supervision group, and I think my peer supervision has generally been very complementary to my formal supervision with a supervisor. At the moment, it's absolutely critical because I've said I've inadvertently lost my supervisor. So I'm currently looking for a new one, which sounds like a bid for offers, doesn't it? But I'm looking to find a new supervisor. But peer supervision is really important, and of course, the dynamics that we talk about that I've just raised here, Cashel, is equally pertinent for peer supervision as well. You know, what we have to remember is that in working with risk, if you like, and this is really kind of distilling it down, but there's an intrapersonal process and there's an interpersonal process in the supervisory dialogue, whether that be with a formal contracted supervisor or whether it be in kind of formally contracted peer supervision. And what I mean by that is that the intrapersonal dialogue is something that goes on within us, that happens within us. And that can be depending on a modality and our language that's used, but I don't really want to get hung up on language around our kind of counter-transference or our edge of awareness responses to the client, you know, how the client is touching us in the relationship, how we feel in relation to the client, the kind of perceptions and responses, the client's story, aspects of the story that may resonate for us. I might have said this before, some of you may have heard this before, but in face-to-face training around working with suicide in therapy, I do quite an extended role play where I'm an 81-year-old client who is terminating their therapy, and it emerges that I'm terminating because I've made a decision to end my life. And I talk about the reasons why I've decided to do that, and the group kind of work with me as the client. And it's not uncommon for quite a lot of people in the group to kind of get where I'm coming from, because I put a very compelling case as to why I'm making an informed decision about my living and dying, and feel that I have the right to do that. I have the right under law to do it, so I don't see why counsellors should stop me. And so that provokes a certain set of responses in the group. And then I show the next slide where I am exactly the same client, other than I've swapped the numbers over. So instead of 81, I become 18, and people's responses are very different. And it's like, oh, you know, you have a life to live, and so it immediately triggers a very powerful response in people. And I'm not saying those responses are right or wrong. I'm just saying we're human, and we're impacted by relationships. So all of this takes place in relation to risk, and we know from lots of research, and I know from my experience in working with people and my experience in myself, that risk can provoke lots of feelings. You know, we don't want to be seen to be getting it wrong, the consequences of, say, a client's suicide and what that might mean. And I've experienced client suicide and how devastating that can be. So there's lots of stuff that happens intrapersonally. We then have the other dimension, which is the interpersonal dynamic, which is around the relationship between my client again, and what's said and not said between us, what's said and not said between me and my supervisor, or me and the supervision group. Sometimes there can be a dynamic in a supervision group where the disclosure of a struggle around risk can feel very exposing. Because the struggle around risk can often be a personal one. So there can sometimes be a reticence to talk about, I feel very frightened in response to what might happen to this client in case I'm judged, or I'm not saying I will be, but my fantasy is I might be judged, or feel I should be doing better, or I should be more assertive, or I should be managing this. So I think peer supervision is subject to the same level of dynamic as would be a one-to-one supervision relationship, or a formal kind of group supervision relationship.
Sorry, I was thinking more of, most supervisors have had supervisory training, whereas in peer groups, often the others, or even myself, haven't had such training. We just get together as a group and supervise each other as non-trained supervisors.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sorry I rambled on for 10 minutes answering a question that wasn't actually what you asked. So I'll now try and answer the question, which is what you were meaning, which is around the kind of training. And I go back to what I said before. I mean, I think some supervision training has moved on, but I don't think simply because somebody has done a supervision training that they have necessarily received extensive training around supervising risk. They may have done. I'm not saying supervision training doesn't do that, but I think supervision training, from my experience, and I've had a lot of contact with supervision training programs, I think that they can be open to the same vagaries around risk as can practitioner training. So I wouldn't assume simply because a supervisor holds a supervision qualification that they've been afforded more or extensive opportunity to reflect on these issues as if they had not done that qualification. I think what it does do is provide them often with a theoretical framework within which they can work from these issues. But I think certainly in the UK, and I appreciate this is a this is a generalization and there will be many exceptions to this, but I think we have a long way to go still, actually, in the world of counselling and psychotherapy, both in practice and in supervision, to really equip people to work with this effectively. And also to take ownership of how we do this, because here's another contentious thing which people might disagree with, but I think increasingly around risk, as therapists, we're being pushed and dominated by external models that come from psychiatry, from psychology, that can inform but aren't always a good fit to how we work as counsellors and psychotherapists. And I think that we are increasingly being pushed into a risk-averse position. So I think there's a lot to be done for us taking ownership of what we do, which would inform the training of therapists and supervisors, which perhaps speaks more directly to your question, Cashel. That's a personal opinion, by the way, so please come back, any of you, and say, no, you're completely wrong.
Thank you, Andrew. Just listening to you, I think emphasizes for me how happy I am that we are actually offering this training, this 6 hours training, where people will be able to explore more of these issues. I can see Jane has her hand up. Jane, please go ahead.
Yes, if you're working with a client who's at risk from suicide and, you know, in spite of your best efforts, they do actually commit suicide, what do you feel are good psychological strategies for the therapist to adopt in coping with that to protect themselves emotionally, I suppose, and perhaps professionally?
Oh, that's a really, really helpful question, Jane, but also an equally difficult one too. I've experienced 4 client suicides in my professional life that I'm aware of. The first one for me was most devastating, and I won't repeat the full story because I know some people here will have heard it already. But she came to a session with me and was really buoyant and shook my hand and thanked me for the work and really looked forward to seeing me next week, and left the building and went home and killed herself immediately. So her suicide was known, and I was personally and professionally devastated by that, and I think quite traumatized in hindsight. This is some time ago, but sufficiently impacted that here I am 35 years on still talking about it. Strategies are really difficult, and I'm contacted a lot, because I've written a lot about this. I'm contacted a lot, Jane, by therapists and supervisors who have experienced the death of a client through suicide, some of whom are newly qualified, many of whom have been working for 30, 40 years, and this kind of thing has gone off in their life, and it's been devastating, and it's a very individual process. I think there's something for me. My individual supervision at the time was really helpful, but actually what was really helpful for me was in talking to other practitioners about their experience. And I happened to do that through some research I was doing. I wasn't an academic, and I turned to research as a means of trying to make sense of this for me, because there was very little written. But my learning from that is the more that we can talk to others, if not about the individual client, because obviously we have the client confidentiality, but in terms of our response, I think that there's something that is very normalizing about that. And I use that word deliberately because suicide is about life and death, and that's a shared phenomenon that we all experience in that broadest sense. And the feedback I've had from practitioners is that in addition to kind of self-care strategies and personal therapy, if that's helpful, and certainly supervision, having a clear grounding from which they can think about their practice for themselves, but having the space that they can talk to others about what it feels like to be in that maelstrom is absolutely critically important, and for me was professionally life-saving.
Do you think the therapist has to develop some kind of objectivity, because, you know, it's their life, it's not your life, and you've done what you can for them? Because I feel that, you know, health professionals in general must have to have that a little bit of a hard skin, because otherwise they couldn't cope with their job.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a real tough one, you know, because at the end of the day, the work we do is about relationships, and it's about human relationships. And my experience is that I think I've always been really good at holding professional boundaries. I think I've been really good at self-care and professional boundaries, and I have a very close relationship with my clients, but it's a very boundaried, clear relationship. And that didn't help me at all when Isabel, who is what I've called her, that's not her name, when she ended her life. So I think there's an inevitability, often, not always, but there can be an inevitability about our work that we will be professionally and personally impacted by the death of a client, because it's people that we have known. I think we can achieve a different understanding. I'm not sure for me that we can achieve an objective position, but we can achieve a different subjective position and a different relationship to it. I argue a lot that unless a client doesn't have capacity, as in they are making choices for themselves and are able to do that based on the 4 parameters I put up before, as therapists, we have a responsibility to our clients. We don't have a responsibility for our clients. So we do the best we can for our clients in terms of that responsibility to them, but we don't have responsibility for them. It's really easy, you know, in these settings for us to, I'm not saying you were doing this, Jen, I'm just using your question as a prompt for something that's coming to my mind, but it's really easy for us to kind of make the work artificially clean, that it's fairly clear cut, you know, this is what I would think, this is what I would do, and I'd feel fairly grounded in that. But I think there's something in the moment that kind of pulls us into something. The 4 experiences of suicide I've had have impacted on me differently, so I'm not saying it's always the same, but I kind of think that in virtue of an investment we make relationally to our work, we are always susceptible to the impact of that. And I don't suppose I would want ever to find myself in a situation where I wasn't impacted by my client, or indeed my client's death through suicide. I'm not saying that's what, I know that's not what you're saying, but I
mean, I suppose you could say that, you know, you can be as professional as you are able to be, but at the end of the day, you're human.
You're human. Do you know, when I do training, so at the start of the training around therapists with risk, people will often say, oh, this is something I'm really frightened about, I'm really anxious about, I'm really concerned about. And sometimes I get practitioners who say, oh, do you know, I've been doing this such a long time, this kind of doesn't impact on me anymore. And I say, out of the 2 positions, and I know they're 2 polarities, but out of the 2 positions, the anxiety is not the place that worries me, because I think actually anxiety in response to risk does speak to something that we're being impacted. I think if we're overwhelmed by anxiety, if we're immobilized by our anxiety, then that's not helpful to us or the client. But I think to be able to experience some impact of the client's process is really important. What really worries me are the people who say, I've been doing this for so long that this kind of doesn't affect me anymore. Because then I kind of think, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing it anymore then. Because if you're no longer impacted by your client's process, then, well, kind of what use have you to your client? Because what you're inadvertently communicating to your client is, you don't care enough to bother me anymore. So I think we have to feel it, but I think we can support ourselves and protect ourselves, and not take on a level of responsibility that actually we just cannot hold, because we can't control people's lives.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Jane.
Before I pass the microphone to Barbara, I just wanted to say we have wonderful discussion going in a chat box, but obviously our time is limited. I just want to assure everyone that I always now send the chat box discussion to the presenter, so they can probably incorporate some of the questions which you were raising in their training, which will be much longer. 6 hours is much longer than 1 hour, which we're doing tonight. So Barbara, please go ahead, and that will be the last question we'll take.
Was that me? Because there's more than one Barbara. Oh,
Barbara, who has her hand up, Barbara Rosenthal.
thank you so much. What it has made me consider is that as therapists, we do have that idealized view of that we are completely non-judgmental about everything that our clients bring to us. But actually, do we feel that it is really important that either through peer groups, through supervision ourselves, that we actually really explore our own attitudes to suicide? That that might be informed by our own experience of people ending their own lives. They might be family members, it might be clients, but the attitudes that we may have towards suicide, people ending their own lives, is going to, I think, impact on the way that we are able to stay focused with the client and not be kind of, I can't do this, be our anxiety. We have to explore our own attitudes in depth. And I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Oh, Barbara, if I tried really, really hard, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's absolutely critical, you know, and I say this in the other workshop I do around working with risk. It's like, you know, that there is still this old message given, particularly to trainees, that, you know, as therapists, we leave ourselves at the door and we go in as some sort of tabula rasa. And I think, what a load of nonsense, really. I mean, honestly, are we still kidding ourselves on
Yes.
that one? And even if you're going in working within an analytic frame, and so you are kind of much more absent in kind of the process. I don't mean absence in a judging way, but you take a very particular position within an analytic frame. You're still there. You know, you don't cease to be a human being when you walk through the door. And so, you know, I think that we do take everything about ourselves in. And to answer your question specifically, I think it's absolutely and utterly critical that we do. And I spend a lot of time on this in the sessions, which is, you know, I'm not here to say people should think X, Y, or Z about suicide. You know, that's not my business. That's not here to do that. You know, I'm not saying that you should believe this, or you should believe this, or you should believe this. What I'm saying is you should know what you believe. You should know what your views are. You should know what touches you about this, and you should know why it touches you in that way, what it is about you and your history. Now, that might be your experience in client work. It might have been your own experiences around your own mental health. I can think of a couple of times in my life when I felt suicidal, and that has shaped and changed how I feel. Or suicide in your family, or if you're bereaved through suicide, or indeed faith or spirituality, or music that you listen to, or films that you watch, or what's going on in the world. You know, how does our relation to this change in the context of a worldwide pandemic? Or going to a 1 hour taster session at SDS seminars on a Thursday night, suddenly you're touched in a way that you didn't anticipate. Hey, who knows? And you should know it, because it will change. It's not a static thing. It will change. I have a very high tolerance to risk in my work. When Isabel died, I had a 0 tolerance to risk in my work. And so it changes based on all sorts of things. And if we don't know it, I absolutely give you a cast iron guarantee or your money back that you will act it out in your work.
Yes.
If you do not bring that into your awareness somehow or other, that will get enacted in your work. And when I showed you the slide of the countertransferential responses, that's how it gets acted out in your work. So it's absolutely critical, and it's critical that we know that too as a supervisor, because if for whatever reason we're holding a particular position around risk, or our level of tolerance to risk is quite low, then that's going to profoundly shape the kind of holding support they offer our supervisees. And somebody made a point in the chat, and it's whisked by now, so I can't apologize, I can't remember who said it, but they talked about, you know, the parallel process, you know, what the client brings to therapy, and what happens in that relationship, and what the supervisee brings to supervision gets enacted out. And so there are so many different points in which we can get caught into a very particular dynamic that turns out to be unhelpful for all involved in that process. So Barbara, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head. I would very quickly broaden it out and say this isn't just about risk, this is about everything, isn't it? This is about you know, the kind of internalized attitudes from society, which can speak of discrimination around kind of genders and sexuality and disability and age and culture, and I could go on. And in my experience, and I don't apply this to anyone here, but my experience is that therapists can be notoriously difficult to be open to those parts of themselves that may feel kind of a shadow side. And what you can often get is, no, I don't feel that, everyone is equal, I feel this, I feel that. And actually, whilst we hold that, the more we're open to what sits within us, the more we're open to those kind of aspects of our internalized prejudice that sits in those sedimentary layers of our life, the more able we're to work with that proactively and positively in our work and not act it out. I appreciate, Barbara, you inadvertently sent me off on a bit of a rant and soapbox then. Thank you for that. But your core question is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And that was very profound, that last sentence that you said, absolutely profound. At a good point to finish our conversation. I apologize to all the other Barbaras who maybe wanted to ask questions. We'll do it next time. And I hope you will want to carry on this discussion, because genuinely, I love listening to Andrew, and he's got tons of experience and tons of advice and just thoughtfulness. So sorry, Andrew, I'm just singing praises to you, but I hope I put several times the link to the course. And again, as I said, it is on super early bird discount until tonight. So I hope we will continue this conversation on Andrew's course in March. Thank you everyone for coming. Andrew, thank you very much for your presentation and your answers. And as always, you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes. And I hope to see you in a couple of weeks' time at the next Thursday. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you so much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
all.
so much.
Oh God.